Hey all, so this marks my first actual CCP video. I don't know if I'm going to do gameplay on these particular champions, but I do really like to read through spotlights and get a conceptual framework for how characters work, and so now I'm able to do that given that I've actually had the ability to play them and test a few things, and so hopefully that can add some context that also helps you inform how you're approaching these before they've even come out. So we're going to start with Titania, and let's just go through her bio. You know what? Actually, let's skip right over her bio. She's a She-Hulk rival, right? So we are going to read through the mechanics because it's good to know right away there are a lot of debuffs involved here. Like, a lot of debuffs. But there is also unblockable, unstoppable, and indestructible. That is a very powerful weapon, and so we are going to be keeping that in mind as we read everything else. The cooldown is going to be very important. And then of course she also has a lot of Furies. So, we can kind of skip over the base stats and abilities. That is below average attack, but we just saw she has a lot of Furies, so I'm not really concerned about that. I think that is a decent amount of health, but there are other big mitigating factors around her effective health pool, which we'll get to. And then her PI is solid. If I'm remembering correctly, I think this is roughly on par with Overseer. So a decent investment for somebody who's not chasing like top 10 in AQ, but not a huge deal. So, down to actually getting to her kit. Right off the bat, we have one of the most important ones, which is that she is immune to buffs. I love the flavor text here, but like Red Guardian, like Spider-Man 2099, and like the upcoming Ant-Man rework, she simply cannot gain buffs. So that is an incredibly strong piece of utility. It effectively makes her immune to, as you see here, Man-Thing, but also Dormammu, also Mojo. You don't have to worry about the burden of Might node in AQ. All of the things that we were sending Defiance attackers for, because they just turned them off, she has built into her kit at all times. You also see a small amount of physical resistance here. That's nice, but this isn't huge, right? Only a few hundred will help you. It probably isn't going to save you on its own. So, like we said, the Haymakers are the core of her kit. And this is when you get unblockable, unstoppable, and indestructible for 4 seconds, which is a fairly long time in the scale of this particular game. It's worth noting that unblockable, unstoppable, and indestructible all together effectively mean you have free intercepts. You have free openings. Because this happens on a dash, you can go ham from anywhere on the screen and you will land the attack as long as your opponent is not actively in the middle of a special. So this is really, really strong and gives her a lot of control of a fight. You can also, if you time it properly, if you activate these by throwing a heavy attack and pushing your opponent red, you will be indestructible. She can tank special 3s. Plus it's a passive, so unlike Luke Cage, it's not going to get nullified. This is a very strong ability. Now, I do want to point out the distinction here between performing a dash and the first medium attack. Like it says, activating a heavy attack or throwing her second medium turns this on. So does performing a dash, but that is not the same thing as the first medium. To perform a dash, as you know if you've played a fair amount of Kitty Pryde or seen others do so, you have to have a certain amount of distance because there is a dash animation that then turns into your first medium attack. So that is both a good and a bad thing for her as an attacker because it means you do need a certain amount of space if you want to turn these on at the start of a combo. But it also is very good for controlling things because this means that if you parry the opponent and just go medium, light, 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 you can do whatever you want with the rest of her kit without activating these Haymakers. And that's incredibly important because timing these correctly is huge to getting the most out of Titania. Like I said a second ago, one of the possible uses is tanking special 3s. That is not something you want to fire off early. So like it says, there's a 30-second cooldown, but we will get to how to shorten that later. Very powerful effect, at its base, pretty long cooldown. I will also note that these do work into block, so you can throw a full combo into the opponent, end with a medium, and have that go unblockable, unstoppable, and indestructible. And because you're unstoppable, you can now probably start another combo. There are a lot of ways to use this. It really is a very flexible mechanic. If you are lucky enough to get her, I recommend playing around with what you can do with it. And then, like it says here, these are also huge for damage because while active, every hit, so all basics, all special attack hits, deal a burst of physical damage for each debuff on the opponent. And as we saw earlier when reading over her mechanics, she has access to a lot of debuffs. So, moving on, we have here whenever the opponent is inflicted with a debuff, she gains a Fury passive. And so these just increase attack by 10%. They do last for 15 seconds, so you can stack a fair number of them. And crucially, doing so reduces the cooldown of your Haymakers by 1 second. So this is any debuff. This is not just her personal debuffs, and you can do this through block. So let's focus on offense for a minute. Because you basically want to get back to your Haymakers most of the time, this means that she has some commonalities with how you play Hulkling or Massacre oftentimes, which is that you can do almost full combos into the opponent's block, even if you don't have other windows, inflict debuffs on them, gain your Furies, shorten your cooldown, and then eventually, let's say you only have 3 or 4 seconds left on your cooldown, you can go throw a full combo into the opponent's block, and the light attacks, as we see here, are going to inflict a suppression debuff, going to shorten your cooldown further, gain you more Furies, and then you can end with a medium and activate your Haymakers, so that now you have all of these Furies, you've just put more debuffs on the opponent, and you can go ham. Do not be afraid to hit into the opponent's block, because you want more debuffs, you want to reduce the cooldown. Now, of course, if you can hit them in the face, that's also great. But it's really nice that if the opponent is not giving you openings, or maybe you're trying to bait out a special, so you're just hitting into their block instead of landing full combos, you still benefit, you're still running through your cycle. So keep that in mind. Now, I do want to talk about as a defender. Like it says here, you don't want to block her a lot, because if you just block her full combos, she's going to inflict these suppressions on you, and she is going to gain Furies, and she's going to go unstoppable and unblockable and indestructible more often. But luckily enough, I tested her animations. It is not that difficult to sidestep her. And so if you're not familiar with what that means, it basically means dash back as she is charging at you, as long as you time it correctly. There is enough room between her first medium animation and her first light animation that with most champions you can respond. So it is possible to go a full fight with her and not block any hits. You can think of her kind of like Invisible Woman on Steady Build Up Unblockable in Alliance War. It is possible to play that fight with her unblockable the whole time and just never block, because you're always creating your openings by sidestepping. Start there with Titania and things will be that much easier. So, of course, light attacks are going to give us suppressions. That's nice because even at 5%, these suppressions are going to add up, like it says, mitigate the opponent's defensive power gains, and allow you to be very aggressive. Being aggressive is great because it's going to allow you to inflict even more debuffs, gain more Furies, and get back to your Haymakers. That is always what you're focused on. So we move on to her heavies, and you can see right away that she has access to a stagger. So like Anti-Venom before her, like Mr. Fantastic, there are some science champions that have access to light buff control in the form of staggers. She is yet another one. And like it says, if the first hit lands while the Haymakers are active, then you get another copy of all of her active personal debuffs. So thus far, another suppression, another stagger, and there will be more in the future. It's important to note that this only requires the first hit to land while Haymakers are active. So you can throw these heavies at the very end of your Haymakers, or almost the very end, as long as you're still unblockable and unstoppable, which makes it really easy to throw heavies. That first one will land, and you will get this bonus to her stacks. Like it says, if you cancel this into a special attack, you still get the extra debuffs, they just show up at the end of the special. That means that you may not necessarily get the extra damage during the special from having more debuffs, but at the end of that special, you are going to get your extra debuffs, and you're going to get a bunch of Furies, and you're going to shorten the cooldown on your Haymakers yet again. So, get comfortable with canceling her heavy attacks into specials. Like I said, she doesn't really have a problem landing heavy attacks because of how much time she spends unblockable and unstoppable. But you are also going to want to practice heavy countering with her, in my personal experience, because she does have quite good reach on the heavy, and it is, as I said earlier, going to give you access to a lot of debuffs at once, and, you're sensing a theme here, get you back to your Haymakers. It's all about keeping as much uptime on those Haymakers as you possibly can. Moving on to the specials, you can see both the special 1 and 2 here both inflict a weakness. So 8 seconds is not that long, but the special 1 here does inflict the debilitate debuff, which can let you turn that 8 seconds into 12 seconds, right? And that debilitate lasts a really long time. So in a lot of fights, what I have found I want to do is throw the special 1 first to make all of my debuffs, my weaknesses, my staggers, my suppressions, last longer, and then I work into the rest of the rotation. But let's talk about how weakness works for a second. So unlike Fury, which normally just modifies your base attack, if Titania has an attack value of 1,000, then her 10% Furies are giving her 100% extra attack for each Fury. It's very linear that way. Weaknesses stack linearly, but they apply at the end after attack has been modified. So an opponent where their base attack is 1,000 and they have 2 500 potency Furies, a 20% weakness on them is going to reduce their attack by 400, 20% of the total of 2,000, not 40% of their base attack. Now, you don't necessarily need to always be keeping track of exactly what that means, but the important point is that weakness is very strong. This will always affect modified attack, and therefore you can really think about these 5% as reducing incoming damage by 5%. It's also really important to talk about the inequity mastery, since we're discussing all of these long-term debuffs. The inequity mastery, for those of you who aren't familiar, allows you to effectively apply invisible weaknesses to your opponent for each debuff on them. The strength of those weaknesses per debuff varies with your rank in the mastery, but it caps out at, if I remember correctly, 36%, meaning that you have another very large weakness on your opponent. So let's say that you throw your special 1, you get your debilitate up. Let's say that that applies 5 weaknesses, like it says here, right? 5 hits. So that's a 25% weakness just from this, and because that's a debilitate and 5 new debuffs here, even if you had no other debuffs on your opponent, which is unlikely given that this is Titania, you are already looking at a 25% reduction plus a 36% reduction. You have cut your opponent's outgoing damage by 3/5. And you can stack even more weaknesses with more special attacks. So it is possible to get to the inequity, or to get to the weakness cap with her, which is 90%. That would require stacking 11 weaknesses, But that actually only requires you to have all the weaknesses up from 2 specials and then 1 more. If you throw special 1 into special 2, you are probably already at that like 85% reduction. That is, it's hard to overstate just how powerful that is for keeping Titania alive. Add into that the fact that she has suppression, so her opponents are gaining fewer specials, and just how hard she hits, plus the fact that she can go indestructible. If you get her rotation down, she feels very, very safe. So keep that in mind as you're reading the rest of this kit. She can do great damage, but I think it's really important to remember that this is a character who is very good at preventing damage. So, before we move on, let's just say the Special 2 does inflict this physical vulnerability for 20 seconds. It doesn't stack, but you can refresh it. And 20% physical vulnerability is very powerful. Because I believe the way that this works, if I remember correctly, is that this applies a physical vulnerability based on what 20% physical resistance would be as a positive value. But if you are fighting an opponent that has 0 physical resistance, because of the way the diminishing returns curve works, and I'm going to save that for another video. If any of you have questions, let me know in the comments. Because of the way that formula works, negative 20% resistance actually works out to more than negative 20%. And so if you are fighting somebody who does not have built-in physical resistance, then this Special 2 is actually going to magnify your outgoing damage by more than 20%, because all of Titania's damage is physical. Very strong effect, especially if you throw it while you have a Debilitate up and extend that 20 seconds to 30 seconds, which probably means you're never not going to refresh it, and at that point it's almost permanent for the fight. So the Special 3 brings her Haymakers back, period, ignoring their cooldown. That's already amazing. 6 seconds of unblockable, indestructible, and unstoppable lets you do a whole lot of damage and control the fight. You also inflict all of these other debuffs. And they do all have effects. Fatigue reduces critical rating, exhaustion reduces critical damage, decelerate reduces the ability accuracy of evade and unstoppable, disorient reduces block proficiency and defensive ability accuracy, falter causes attacks to miss, which doesn't matter because you're already indestructible, stifle reduces offensive combat power rate. It's kind of the inverse of suppression. Wither reduces ability power rate, petrify reduces ability power rate and healing rate. Cowardice reduces special damage, and intimidate reduces block proficiency and causes the opponent to behave more defensively and block more often. That's what those all do, but to a large extent it just doesn't matter what they do, because as this note says, putting all these debuffs on the opponent means you just gained a ton of Furies, plus you have your Haymakers active, so now all of your hits are doing physical damage for each debuff on the opponent. And like it says, you can just throw as many hits as you possibly can to try and get all of that burst damage in, or you can start spamming heavy attacks to stack even more of these debuffs, get even more Furies, and keep doing burst damage. Her Special 3 is pretty impressive. Definitely worth playing around with. But to talk about her signature ability, whenever she inflicts a stackable personal debuff, so this is basically everything except the debilitate and the physical vulnerability, she can apply it twice. Because of the way her kit works and how these things cascade together, I do think that getting her to high sig, getting that up to 30%, is very worth it. And then kind of like She-Hulk, she's better against large and extra large opponents. Nice. So, like it says, for her strengths and weaknesses, I really do think creating her own openings is one of the biggest things here. She just controls the fight. You have a lot of debuffs, and that means that you are going to easily hit the inequity cap. You have all of those weaknesses. She can just be pretty darn hard to kill. Plus, remember, she has a small amount of physical resistance on top of all of these other things. Titania is tanky. Now, of course, if you slow her, she doesn't have any kind of debuff shrugging, so now you don't get access to your unstoppable. That makes things a lot harder. If her opponents can evade, then she's not applying her debuffs. That slows her down. She doesn't have any way to control evade. Notice that that is actually one of the few debuffs she doesn't have on her special 3. She does have Decelerate, which is kind of a partial slow, but she doesn't have access to slow herself. And of course, Purify. You use her against somebody like Kingpin, and it's not going to go well for you. But it's good that she has strengths and weaknesses. Purify is mostly a skill mechanic. I really do like the way that she came out. From playing both with her and against her, she feels pretty good. Like I said, she's very tanky. But there are champions that do more damage than her to compensate. And on defense, yeah, she can be kind of scary, but if you can slow her down, if you can purify her debuffs, and if you can master sidestepping her, she is, at least in my testing thus far, pretty darn manageable. So briefly going over the synergies, a lot of these are very, very good. So with She-Hulk, she starts with 10 Fury passives, and they last longer. That is very strong for her, lets her keep her damage much higher, and she comes out of the gate swinging. She-Hulk's heavy attacks do physical damage for each debuff on the opponent. You combine this especially with Mr. Fantastic, but even if you just have She-Hulk, she already likes to heavy spam from time to time, and this is just going to make her hit that much harder when she does so. So, increasing the potency of Fury effects for all of these champions is quite nice. Colossus, Drax, Hulk, Hyperion, they all like their Furies. But honestly, even at 20%, this is not huge. Because this is not a flat 20%. We're talking about, okay, if Hyperion's Furies increase his attack by roughly 50% of his base attack, then increasing those Fury potencies by 20% means now those Furies increase it by about 60%, right? So it's strong. This is worth having, and it's one of the reasons I want her on my roster. Don't overstate what it means for any of these characters. This next synergy with the coming soon tease, you see Doom and the Hood, who are both very strong champions, easy to bring along in powerful synergy teams. She gets extra ability accuracy for her debuffs. Because this doesn't affect the ones from her signature ability, it's not actually affecting any debuffs with a chance to apply. So you are mostly looking for getting around effects that reduce your ability accuracy, but that does happen, right? We have Infuriate from Hercules, we have characters with Concussion, there are a number of other things that can get in the way. This allows her to ignore those to some extent. So, Captain Marvel, the classic one, not the movie version. That's important to point out. But then Storm and Yondu are both very strong right now. Extra critical rating for Storm is fantastic, as well as, of course, critical rating for Titania. Special attacks not generating power is just very strong for literally everyone. That's always been one of Magic's greatest strengths. It's one of Doom's greatest strengths. Adding that to all of these characters is going to make fights with them easier. And 400 critical damage rating is great for all of these. I really do like Yondu. I think his buff is being slept on. So this one I like quite a bit. I love that the synergy with Ghost does almost nothing for her. Ghost doesn't need any help. But this is a very flavorful one. I love giving Black Cat some extra here, and then 20% more power from heavy attacks. I love that this is already a character where you're going to enjoy heavy spamming. Now you get more benefit for it. You throw a big special 3 and your opponent doesn't have a ton of power. This is just going to allow you to immediately throw a bunch of heavies and get all of those debuffs up. Very strong synergy, because maybe you can even cancel it into a special at the end of that. And then we have a truly nutty one, because intercepting the opponent is going to pause her Fury passives and reduce the Haymaker cooldown. And I would like to point out that this combos very powerfully with the She-Hulk synergy, which is already making Titania's Furies last longer. That means you have longer before they expire to land intercepts and pause them. From playing with this one, you really can stack a big number of Furies, and the fact that it reduces the Haymaker cooldown gives you access to more tools that allow you to inflict more debuffs, which are going to allow you to stack even more Furies and get more openings so that you can more safely go for intercepts. This synergy is really, really strong. And then I'm personally not a huge fan of the champion, but I know he does have his fans, and just making him have access to his accelerated ramp up against literally everyone is pretty darn good. So that's Titania. Let me know in the comments if you guys enjoyed this. Hopefully I was able to put some of these abilities into a little bit extra context. I'm very excited for her coming out, and I hope you are too. Until next time, thanks so much for watching, and take care.